I'm very honored to be invited here to give this talk for a number of reasons. My position right now is as director of sales and marketing for a company called Hogstrite USA. When I say I'm honored, it's really, I truly mean that. And as you'll probably see in this talk, that the BCA, well, when I was a member, it was the BPA, really played a significant role in the start of my career. And my cousin's boyfriend was working at another hospital, and he had heard that the two medical photographers had been fired. And so I started calling up human resources, and I kept on bugging them, and to the point where they just said to that medical illustrator, head of the department, just talk to this guy, because we want him to stop calling us. So I went there, and I met with him, and he said, well, tomorrow night we're hosting a chapter meeting of the BPA, and would you like to come? And I did. The funny thing was I had almost front row tickets for a concert, and I had to give them up to go to the meeting, right? But it was just, the smartest thing I ever did, and I got to know the BPA, and I got the job, and it really set me off on my career. So what I want to do is really look at how that one step there started leading me down a road that then I was able to use and build upon in my life. This talk has had many versions, and one of them was called Sliding Doors. And if anybody knows this movie, one of Gwyneth Paltrow's first movies, it's actually two movies in one. She's in London, she works in some office, and she decides to go home early, and she goes and she gets caught in every door. Getting on the tube, she's caught, and she gets home, and her boyfriend's there, and her life goes on the way it is. The other version is she makes all the doors, gets home, and catches her boyfriend in a compromising position and changes her life. And so I think I look at my life in many ways as constantly being given these doors and deciding if I'm going to go through them or not. And we always say, you always have a choice, and sometimes even not making a choice is making a choice. Over my career, I've sort of talked about my life being divided in half between this medical scientific side and the fine art side, because I never stopped doing my photography once I got out of school. I continued doing it. Now sometimes I had more time for the medical stuff that I needed to do. Other times I had more time for my personal stuff, but there was this constant shift. But some of these doors that open and the things that come to you early in your life and you don't even realize it. The line, out of the Stones song that you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you just might get what you need. Growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I was Italian Catholic family going to an Italian grade school. A Catholic grade school. My father was a blue collar worker. We didn't have any money. Of course, we didn't know we didn't have any money then because no one really talked about that. And I had never had a new bike. And if anybody here has ever gone to a Catholic grade school, you know that back then there were all these candy sales and everything they always had to raise money for the church and to build a new church and whatever. So they had this candy sale, and first prize, selling the most amount of boxes of candy, was a brand new bike. And so I was bound and determined. I was going to do it. I sold it in my neighborhood. I sold it to my relatives. I had my mother drive me around to different neighborhoods. I stood in the busiest corner intersection close to my house. The day that they're going to announce the winner, we're in the auditorium of the church, and I'm sort of sitting on my seat because I know I'm going to get up right away because they're going to and the mother gets up that's running it, and she announces the winner, who just happens to be her son, who just happens to sell one more box of candy than I did. Except second prize was a camera outfit. And so, when I look back, even though, of course I wanted that bike, but the reality is I got that camera, which started me off. If you can see, it's still the same camera. It's still set on black and white, and you'll see a lot of my work is black and white, because back then, my parents had to actually stop me from photographing because you had to send the film to be processed, and they couldn't afford it, even the black and white prints. But that really set me off on my career. The other, my first life lesson is, realizing that you have to learn to take rejection, that, you're putting yourself out there. And every time I was rejected, actually, I've learned that something good has come from that. And I was really being redirected to someplace else. I think being young, I was always, I'm going to control it, and I'm going to do this. And I just learned that every time I tried to do that, it was the wrong thing. For me, in criticism, when I was young, I could look at something and just draw it. And one time we were in northern Wisconsin, and there's a Smokey the Bear illustration up there, and I just picked up a pencil and paper and drew it. And my mother came and she said, you copied that. You didn't draw that. And it's like it didn't match. And so and I loved to draw. And through grade school and into high school, I took art classes until this. I think I was a junior in high school, and I did this, and the art teacher with a red pen on this drawing, and then threw in this whole line of, he just says, this C minus was a gift, and then he just goes on to berate me in my art and what I did, right? And of course, I wasn't mature enough to, understand what he was saying. I'd actually like to find him now and thank him for that, because what it did was it stopped me from ever picking up a pencil or a paintbrush again and doing any drawing. But what it did do was, I think, allow me and open the door to photography again. But it was really the start of understanding that if you're going to do art, that you have to, and you're putting your heart and soul out there, there's some people that don't like it, and you're just going to have to live with that. And if you don't, then you just don't need to be, you need to either get a thicker skin or find something else to do. The other thing I sort of learned in high school was Amarillo Slim, greatest poker player in the world. I played a lot of poker when I was in high school for money. And we didn't have cable TV back then. You had ABC Wild World Sports. The lesson I learned here was they would have once a year the World Championship of Poker, and they'd have $1 million on this table, right? And so in 1972, Amarillo Slim wins the World Series of Poker, and the first question is interviewed and says, "Amarillo, you're the greatest poker player in the world." And he says, "No." He says, "Actually," he says, "I was just the best player here this weekend." He says, "The greatest poker player in the world could be some guy that plays with his buddies in his garage in Detroit every Saturday. And I just happened to be here." And it really taught me a lesson about who we look at in terms of who are the best, and starting to develop this feeling that, just do your own stuff and do it as well as you can, and don't worry about who's the best and who's not the best. In high school, I had classes in printing. Milwaukee is a huge graphic arts city at the time. It was like if you got a job as an apprentice in a printing outfit, you were set for life, because that's my father and mother told me, is I had to find something that I was going to work at for the rest of my life and had some security. You'll see I have had no security in terms of jobs, but the teacher said, if you get done with all your assignments, I'll teach you how to process and print film. And at the end of my senior year, I had a camera, shot some black and white film, and processed it. And I got in the morning, and at like 4 o'clock, there's this knock on the door. I had no idea that the whole day had passed. I was so engrossed in making prints, And anybody that's ever done a silver gelatin black and white print, it says, that first time that print comes up in the tray, there's that magical moment that we had of making a photograph. And what I think is sort of interesting today is that you never hear anybody say, there was that magical moment when that file was printed on that inkjet printer and that print came off the inkjet print, right? So we've lost something there. But I was in love with photography, but I had already been accepted into a technical college for printing, and we had a common semester. Printing, photography, visual communications, and commercial art or something. So we knew what everybody did, because we were going to be integrating our careers with everybody. And I found myself hating to go to my printing class and couldn't wait to go to photography. And I made the decision to change my major. I also, though, what I did was I had to put myself through school. So I worked in a steel mill. But, this quote by Mark Twain about the two most important days in your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. And that's what happened to me when I made my switch to photography, is I knew that I had found something that I loved so much that in a sense I couldn't even believe that I was going to get paid to do it. So I always like to say that I've never worked a day in my life after that, because I never considered anything I did in photography as being work. But in this 2-year Associate in Applied Science degree program, they didn't teach us anything about art. They taught us how to become a photographic problem solver. You're going to be going out there, you need the skills with a wide array of photographic problems that you're going to have to figure out. So, we did Schlieren photography, Kirlian photography, photographic chemistry to the nth degree that, I knew anything you could ask me back then about chemistry and why films did what and why developers did what. But we also actually did holograms. And I remember, of course, being a smart 18, 19-year-old that thinks you know everything. I'm like, we do these holograms and we're using lasers. When am I ever going to have anything to do with imaging and lasers? Of course, I had no idea that down the road I was going to be in ophthalmology. And now most of our imaging is done with scanning lasers. But back then, back in the beginning, all the treatment was done with lasers. So it's all those things you sort of learn, and your professors are smart enough to teach you that you don't know really how it's going to help you down the road. We made dye transfer prints. You do a transparency and you do these contrast masks, and you'd make the separation negatives through red, green, and blue light. And then we'd have to put them in these dyes, and we're printing with yellow, magenta, cyan. And again, the smart 18-year-old that knows everything, I'm like, when am I ever going to have to worry about making prints with cyan, yellow, and magenta dyes, right? That's all we do now. I learned a lot of things about a lot of parts of photography. I didn't learn really anything about the art of photography. Our basic photo 101 was done with a view camera, 4x5 view camera. That's how we started learning photography. These were the 3 books that were our Bibles, right? This was it. We learned photography by using the zone system. I don't think I picked up a 35mm camera to my second year of college, right? So, and I think these books should be rewritten, and they should just be turned into digital, because they're so good. But then, sort of, you start looking at photographers, and for me, I started thinking, well, who did I want to be like, right? And so for me, it was Ansel Adams. He taught the zone system, used a view camera. His name was A.A. Ansel Adams. I was M.M. Mark Maio. So there had to be some connection there, something predetermined. But I thought that I was going to be, at least in my fine art part of my life, was going to be the next Ansel Adams. Of course, you can never be someone but yourself. But things that stuck that I learned back then, it's like you don't take a photograph, you make it. That was pounded into our head. We don't take anything. It's all, you think about it and you make an image. You don't take it. Ansel Adams felt if he made 12 good negatives a year, that was a good year. So again, that was my standard. If today's day where we go out and photograph for the week and we've got 1,000 files, digital files, is kind of crazy. But this was really something that took me a while to learn, but there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And I fell into this. Back then in the 70s, view camera, large format, everything sharp, these beautiful, well exposed, well printed. I made a lot of technically perfect, boring photographs. Now, some of the photographers that influenced me when I looked at their work and studied it was Eugene Smith, working in bodies of work, doing documentary work that really had an appeal to me as I was going through school, or Bresson with The Decisive Moment. Looking at things like that, I wasn't drawn to portraits or commercial or advertising. I couldn't stand being in the studio creating something like that. I wanted to be out interacting. And also, being told to study painters. This was a popular Nighthawk, the name of the poster from Edward Hopper. But there's that look, sort of that removed observer looking at life that that really resonated with me. But it was also understanding, or starting to understand, that anything we do, it's not, again, trying to copy someone else. It's really saying something personal about our life through our work, whatever that medium happens to be. But with Hopper, though, I looked and studied his light. When I go out and photograph, I photograph light. That's what I look for. And so in his paintings there were many examples of being able to learn how to look at and see light. The other painter was Charles Sheeler. And again, I liked not only his formalism and his use of light, but his subject matter. He did a lot of work with industrial landscapes. And again, I'm growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the middle of industrial America. That's my neighborhood. That's what I see. That's what I know. And so I was drawn to that. Now, what I didn't know, I knew he was a photographer. So the work on the right is the Ford plant, River Rouge Ford plant. Image on the right is of the grain elevators in Buffalo, New York. And that's going to come to play down in my story, but I had no idea back then just how important that was going to be. Using a 4x5 view camera, you sort of learn that there's no better time to crop a bad composition than just before you released a shutter release. Again, you only had so many sheets of film loaded in your holders. If you were out and doing a trip, you only had so many shots that you were going to make, and so you had to think about it a lot more than we do now. These are some images from back when I was in school. The strange story behind this image is that I was driving in middle Wisconsin, and I was coming around a corner. I didn't see this, but I knew that this house was here. I just knew it in my mind. And sure enough, it was there, and I went and I explored it, and then I wanted to make a photograph, and so I went up on this hill, this mound, and set up my view camera just as the storm started coming in, and I made this image. And a couple years ago, I'm driving the same area with a family friend, and I go, oh, they're right up around here. That's where that old abandoned farmhouse is. He goes, he says, you mean the one with the Indian burial mound in the back of it? That's what I was standing on when I was making this photograph. So there was sometimes those strange things that happen. For me, this was an assignment in school that we had to do a self-portrait. And that white wall was me, because I grew up with this extended Italian family. I had 30 first cousins on my mother's side. I saw them every weekend. Everybody in my family stayed there in Milwaukee, but I knew I was going. I don't know where, and I didn't know, it wasn't because I hated it, but I just knew that I wasn't going to stay there. And so that sort of represents it. And the other thing, nowadays, when I talk to some groups and everybody's doing digital and they've never done film, and they'll say, I see in black and white. And they're like, what do you mean you see in black and white? And I thought about it, and now part of it was the fact that we grew up at a time when we didn't have a color TV in the house until I was almost out of high school. So everything I saw was in black and white on TV. You start thinking like that, and you see how some of the movies were lit in the 40s and the 50s, and how well they used light and exposure and contrast. And the other thing is that we were taught to use a black and white viewing filter when we'd go out with our view cameras, right? So we'd look at a scene and we'd look at the scene through that and get some idea of the relationship of tones, help us with figuring out exposure, so that, this would look like this. And so for me, even now, I don't look in the back of a camera. I spent 35 years exposing film. I never had a chance to look to see what it's going to be until it was done, and I had to learn to make it right while it was in the camera, not fix it later in some program. So, to me, that's what I see, I see in black and white, and most of my work is in black and white. Like I said, I knew what type of photography I didn't want to do. Life magazine folded just as I was starting photography school. And that was, at the time, that was the place to have documentary projects shown. They would pay photographers to spend, a month or so working on a project and telling a story. And I had this ideal that I wanted to somehow help people with my photography. Somehow I was going to show them something, and there was going to be a call to action because I was going to inform them with my photographs. My English class was all photographers. And the smart thing that they did was they required us to do a research paper on some area of photography we didn't know anything about. And I chose medical photography. I think that, yes. And I thought, wow, here's a way to take all these skills that I learned and apply them actually in a way to help people. And so that's what I decided I was going to be coming out of school. And then being exposed to the BPA. Again, back then there were enough people in the city the size of Milwaukee to actually have our local chapter. And so we were all meeting, once a month we'd get together and someone would make presentations and you had people that you could learn from. When I told my mother I was going to be a medical photographer, her first reaction was, oh, so you're going to do all the baby photographs. But no, we did do baby photographs. This was a slide series that they needed done to teach nursing students about cesarean births. But as many of you in here probably have done also, we do photomicrography, and then I actually had my father-in-law build a metal holder that we would then take we'd take 4 slides and put them in there, stick them in there, and label them with A, B, and C, and D, and then put neutral density filters under them to balance them all out so that we could do one photograph like this that was then going to be in a book. And I did hundreds of these things. This is something that you can do in seconds in PowerPoint. But at the same time, I also looked at what I was doing. I did all the typical things that a medical photographer did, but also then started looking at how could I take what I was doing and sort of somehow be more artistic with it, give the doctors what they wanted, but then still have the time to do something else. At the same time, though, I kept, if you only photograph and you feel like it, you'll never be totally successful as a photographer. And so I was working just as hard on my own photography as I was working in the hospital. And that really was about, I'd carry a 4x5 view camera around, I'd walk the neighborhoods. We did a project where we documented Milwaukee, and I had a section of Milwaukee that I documented, and that's what I did, and we had an exhibit of it. So this was from a self-assigned series. I'd photograph every day on Christmas Day. I'd go out with my view camera in the morning before we'd all get together for dinner and make photographs. And this was just this little kid who was playing with his cat rather than sitting around like the rest of us was with his family and having dinner. I also learned or decided, back then my friends, everybody graduated from college and had to go to Europe. They had to go see Europe. And I sort of said, something, before I go to Europe, I actually have to understand my own country. And so I just made it a point and I tried to sort of do some graphic of where I've been, and not to brag, but I've been like everywhere there. Every major, mid, and minor road probably in America I've driven down over my lifetime of just wanting to explore. My wife and I will just get in the car with our cameras, and it's just you go down the road, and I don't know where I'm going to end up, but I'll end up someplace. But it's really about photographing. And so these are some of the images for a series that I've put together. Other than the fact I've done them, I call them blue highways because they're all the small little roads on the maps that you'd go down across the U.S. And I was using 35 millimeter 4x5, 2 1/4. It was a period of time where, I was learning how to sort of figure out my vision and voice in my art, but I thought most of it was done by choosing another camera or another film or another lens, and somehow that was going to make my photographs better. And I also started figuring out that you have to please yourself. The photographer Ralph Steiner said it great. The only thing unique about all of us is we're all unique. And I can't try to be like another person. I can't be as creative. I just have to be as creative as I am. And just do the images and do the photography that actually please myself. So I worked as a medical photographer for about 3 years, and my boss said, there's a guy that used to work here, went to the same school you did, and he's doing this stuff called ophthalmic photography. Maybe you'd be interested in it. So I took a vacation day, made an appointment, went to the ophthalmic photography department at the university, spent a day, and 6 months later they had an opening. I applied for it and got it. And, to me it was like, what better way, if my goal was to help people with photography through my photography, what better way than to help them with their vision? by being an ophthalmic photographer. And I know some of you do ophthalmic photography here, or at least know about it, but each part of this eye has a subspecialist that takes care of it, and each subspecialist has a subspecialized imaging modality that's associated with it. So I'm this guy that's a medical photographer who thinks if you've got eye problems, you just get another pair of glasses, dropped into one of the, at the time, then it became, as some doctors have said to me over the years, I was at the perfect storm of retina at the time. Some of the top retina people in the world were there at the time. And so I got to learn from them. And we did images of the retina. We did it for diagnosis, treatment, clinical trials. It was fluorescein angiograms where we'd inject dye, sodium fluorescein dye, and photograph it as it goes through the arteries and the veins. They were doing laser treatments off these. We were doing them in stereo or 3D, photographing the front of the eye, doing things for pediatrics, anything you could think of. And then at the same time, we were also medical photographers. So we were doing all the slides for lectures. I was doing 16 millimeter movies in the operating room. We're doing portraits of everybody. We were doing small product photography for their talks that they were given. So we were doing all of this as ophthalmic photographers. And again, I started looking at things to say, as I was photographing, how can I make some of these things look a little bit nicer or different than just being something. I give them what they needed for the diagnosis, but I then had the freedom to actually start making some other images. And that's when I really started to understand and describe myself as sort of being split down the middle between art and science. There were these things that were similar, but at times I was doing one and at other times I was doing the other, and they constantly played off and informed one another. It wasn't like I could only do one or the other. As changes in the regular photography were coming into play, it informed my ophthalmic photography. On the other hand, there were things that happened in ophthalmic photography. I mean, we were doing digital imaging in ophthalmic photography in 1985, way ahead of the curve of what we did here. So those things kept on playing back and forth. And here's an image of using a lens. It's a lens with 3 mirrors on it, and you have to examine the eye with one of the mirrors and then photograph in light through a mirror onto the eye, onto the iris of the eye. From somebody that didn't know anything, now I'm actually doing the exact same things the doctors are doing in the exam room, and I'm doing images, but still looking at ways to make things look sort of pretty in a sense. In this particular case, there's actually 2 more cysts over here, and I photographed all the cysts, but then tried to light it to show it in a different way without a reflection. We didn't have Photoshop there, so I couldn't get the reflection out. Here, these are called zonules. They're attached to our lens of our eye that makes our lens focus close and far, right? So when we start getting to be 40, the ability for those zonules to be as elastic, we start to lose that. But this person had their lens pushed back into their eye, but these zonules were still attached. So this is just using red eye. I mean, we've all done red eye photographs when we photograph somebody in a party, and the light's really close to the lens. You get this red reflex back, but it's using the red reflex to actually show those. And then doing things. This was something for the eye bank that they wanted an exhibit. Ironically, this is the daughter of one of the retina fellows who then went on at Emory. Because what happened was I actually went from Milwaukee. I got recruited to head the department at Emory University, and she's now an ophthalmologist. Did her training at Emory, and now she works at Emory. The other sort of connection that I have indirectly with this organization is that in the 60s, when ophthalmic photography started to be used, biomedical photographers were doing all the ophthalmic photography, and they were members of the BPA. And as that profession started to grow, this group of people wanted to have more education at this meeting on ophthalmic photography, and they actually thought, we should actually have meetings along with the ophthalmologists. So that caused a rift within this organization, and this group of a lot of these people right here then broke away from the BPA and formed an organization called the Ophthalmic Photographer Society in 1969. I started in '78 in ophthalmic photography, but if it wasn't for them, these were my mentors. These are the people that put together an educational organization to help teach the rest of us how to do ophthalmic photography, because there was no place to go. after a number of years, I then, I volunteered to lecture. I volunteered to do all kinds of things, run meetings, give lectures, run workshops. Then I ran for office, and I was on the board of directors, and then I got elected to be president, and I did that for 2 terms. But I mean, we had board of directors, board of education, board of certification. We created, our own certification program in ophthalmic photography. It was also at the time that I was doing so much of this that I started really concentrating on the technical aspects of photography. So, like I said, I was making these technically perfect, boring photographs, but I really didn't understand that. I had limited time, so when I was able to do photography, I was doing that. I was doing film tests, I was doing development tests, I was using a densitometer, I was trying this developer, this film combination, this paper. I was doing everything except making photographs that actually said anything. And also in the mode of then when I did get out to photograph, this whole thing about if I got up real early in the morning before sunrise, I climbed, I did this hike up there, got there for sunrise, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, it should be a good photograph because I did all of that. So I was still in that mode, still learning that it really doesn't make any difference how much time and effort I put into it. A good photograph could be something that you find when we walk out this door. It's not about, did I go someplace special? Most photographs are probably in our backyard. But I did a lot of landscape photography, just because, again, I was still in that mode of, trying to be Ansel Adams and going to the Southwest and photographing. These we did actually on our honeymoon. We spent a month out in the Southwest, driving, camping in our Jeep. Great Sand Dunes National Park. And then, being the fact that I was in ophthalmology and I had done medical photography, I still was drawn to more macro things or closer up things. So I did a lot of this, and most of it was on Kodachrome, and it was because I didn't have to make my own prints. I sort of got away from black and white for a little while. But I also learned that, doing the same thing that I was safe with really wasn't pushing me and making me grow as a photographer. And so, trying some new things and shaking it up a bit and photographing things that I wasn't as comfortable with. Going out, instead of just doing color, going out and getting back to doing my black and white photography again. The photographic life lesson number 11 is that this is something I learned from John Sexton, is that the best photographic accessory in your camera bag is the U-turn. How many times have we been going down the road and we say, oh, that looks great. Well, I'll come back someday and photograph it, right? And then you come back and it's not there. I think the biggest example that probably everybody has probably seen, but doesn't maybe know the story, is Jim Marshall, the sort of photographer for the rock stars. When Crosby, Stills, and Nash formed as a group, and they were in LA, and they didn't know what their name of the group was, but Jim Marshall took them out for a drive in Hollywood, and he found this old house with a porch, and he put them on there and with a couch or something, and he made this photograph. He comes back, and they're like, oh, okay, the name of the group's gonna be Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and they were on the cover as Crosby, Nash, and Stills. They said, oh, we'll just go back tomorrow and photograph it. So they get up early in the morning, they go back, and that night they had knocked down the house. They had bulldozed the house. And so Stills and Nash always have this joke about people getting them mixed up because of that. But you can't go back. For me, we were talking here about the Isle of Skye. So on the Isle of Skye, driving by this place and having the cattle there alongside the road just had never happened before. And so we drove past, and I turned around and came back and parked, and I just photographed this couple photographing the Highland cattle. And as we're walking and talking to other people, this guy's there. And this is actually the way he dresses. And he's actually there with some friends of his from the States who are actually from North Carolina. This friend said, oh, can I make a photograph of you? And so he just sort of said, sure. He stood there, and I asked if I can photograph. So sometimes things like that come, but it's only when you take the time to stop. As a matter of fact, on our way here from Atlanta yesterday afternoon, I stopped a number of times to make photographs as we came along the back roads. But along with, U-turn is also life lesson number 12 is the way back. And what does that mean? It's typically you'll go down a road and you see the things on the way down the road, but you never come back the other way and see them from a different angle, a different time of the day with different lights. So here's another photograph from the Isle of Skye, early morning, sun coming up, storm in the background, and then later on, coming in the afternoon, coming the other way and having a completely different view. So it's something that I always think of now as I'm traveling. Number 13 is someday. Someday I'm going to go to the Ansel Adams workshop because, of course, he was the person I tried to emulate. And I kept on saying, someday I'm going to do that, and someday I'm going to do that, and then he died. And I was lucky enough to then be able to go. They already had the last Ansel Adams workshop planned. And I was able to go there, and it changed my life in photography. As well as other workshops with other photographers. When I went to Ansel Adams' workshop, there was Jerry Ullsman, Ernest Haas, Paul Campanegro, John Sexton was there, Edna Bullock, and a host of other people. And it really, really changed the way I started to photograph. I mean, Bill was talking about having all this equipment and carrying it around, and now how he uses one camera. For me, Ted Orland and David Bales you could ask them to do a private critique of your work in Ansel's living room. And they did that. And of course, I had my 16 greatest hits of my photographs. I didn't have a body of work at all. And they looked at it and they said, we're going up to the high Sierras tomorrow. And when you go up there, I want you to find something you're going to photograph and put your camera down and don't make a photograph for at least 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes or an hour. Let it tell you how to photograph. And I did. I mean, it's this concept of slow looking. It's not just, it's easy for us now to snap. Even back then, it was easy to snap a photograph, but actually to think about it. So this is a photograph I made. It's not the greatest photograph in the world, but I can tell you that it's completely different because I probably didn't make this photograph. And I walked around this boulder for 45 minutes before I actually made the photograph, and it changed my life in photography. Again, Bill was talking about getting rid of all of his equipment. I brought my Leica there, my Nikon there, my Hasselblad there, and my 4x5 view camera out because I thought the Ansel Adams workshop was about the technical things, and it wasn't that. We didn't do that at all. It was all about helping you try to find out what your voice is, what your vision is, what is it you're trying to say, independent of the equipment you were using. So, I love Miles Davis, and this quote by him is that sometimes it takes a long time, playing a long time, to be able to play like yourself. Because I think too much we try to emulate other photographers, other work that we've seen. How do we have our own work? And the other thing for me that I learned was that I'm my own competition. I'm not trying to be better than anybody else. I'm trying to be the best that I can. And I think I learned back then that if I live to be 100, I'm never going to be as good a photographer as I want to be. I'm always going to be learning and doing better and trying different things to make myself say things through my photographs. So I was at Emory University from 80 to 88 and then got recruited to go up to the State University of New York as an assistant professor of ophthalmology in the medical school. So you figure that one out. I've got a 2-year associate degree in photography, and I'm an assistant professor of ophthalmology. But it was because of, and I'm not saying this to brag, but at the time some other people got that same rank because of what we had learned as ophthalmology was growing. I mean, we were in the middle of everything that was going on in ophthalmology. And what it did for me, though, was it gave me, my chairman was somebody I worked with at Emory. His life wasn't just ophthalmology. He taught poetry and music and had an antique store. And so I knew that I'd go up there and I could work on my own work rather than just being my life dedicated to ophthalmology. So that's what I did. I went up there. I started a Bachelor of Science degree program in ophthalmic photography. I introduced ophthalmic photography to RIT. The other thing I did that had a profound effect on my life was I wanted to get my bachelor's degree. And so Empire State College is part of the SUNY system, and it allows you as an adult to create your own degree. And so I decided I was going to get a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Communications. And so I fashioned it after the RIT program, and I did that. I went to school, and it allows you to go to school working with professors one-on-one on your time, so you don't have to quit school. And one of the things I wanted to do is I was always fascinated with ethnic neighborhoods in northern industrial cities. And so one of the professors there had written these books on Buffalo. He said, you're a photographer. Why don't you take your camera and study a neighborhood as a way of learning about it? He drove me around, found this neighborhood that reminded me of the Italian neighborhood I grew up in, except this was Irish. And that 16-week course continued for the next 16 years in my life. It was an Irish neighborhood that I started photographing. I went into the neighborhood. I immediately saw that they knew that I didn't belong there. I went to the police station, gave them my license plate on my car, gave them my business card, said people are going to be calling about you. But these were the descendants of the guys who hand dug the Erie Canal across New York State. And then they lived there, and they were the guys that were unloading the boats coming across the Great Lakes and loading the barges. So they were the sort of low-class labor. These are talk about TSA security. This was during World War I. I mean, Buffalo fed the world, and so you had to have the security card to actually work on the docks because they were afraid of sabotage by the Germans. I took my Leica with one lens and a couple rolls of film. This Leica doesn't even have a light meter, and that's what I started photographing with. And it's amazing what you see when you've limited yourself to only one lens. And this is only one lens, it's a 35 millimeter lens. And as Bill also pointed out, you don't have a camera bag. People react to you differently. They looked at this camera as I had to be an amateur because I had this old fashioned camera that I was using, right? But I walked the neighborhood, I met people, I looked at the interaction of the neighborhood, the industry, to the people. I got to know the people in the neighborhood. One person would lead me to another person. And finally, one person's father was what was called a grain scooper. So in Buffalo, in 1843, the grain elevator was invented, and a mechanized way of using a steam engine was used to elevate grain from the hold of boats up to elevators. And so the guy that did it was laughed at because he said, people said there's nothing cheaper than the backs of Irishmen. But Joseph Dart invented this, and all of a sudden these guys now had a way of unloading it with these big shovels. Well, I mean, this is an image I made literally walking around an elevator, seeing this guy walk up, going up, and then starting to see the stuff that was happening inside the boats with grain. This actually happens to be an image from Duluth, Minnesota, where they're loading it. But in this image, you can see, here's the deck, the opening in the deck. Here's the elevators up here. And there's four of these holes in each boat, and you can barely see a hump over here. There's two big metal shovels and hooked up with these ropes and pulleys and a motor, and they send the shovels down, and then they pull the grain all the way to the front, and then it gets dumped into this leg with conveyors and buckets that goes up to the top of the elevator. They were doing it this way in 1843, and in 1989, when I walked in there, they were doing it the same way. And I said to myself, somehow I had been chosen, because there used to be 3,000 guys doing this. Now there were only 80. And so that set me on this sort of mission, in a sense, to document and tell the story. And I finished my Bachelor of Science degree and decided that if I was going to do this work, I needed to do this with a master's degree and get more information about this than just the images. But these are just some images made inside. So I would in the morning, before I'd go to the hospital, if they were working, I'd go down and photograph and then go to the hospital and work and then get done and change back into my jeans and go back and photograph it again. I kept on doing this every time that they would come in. I'd do this to unload as they were unloading. This is looking down from the deck of them at the end, using shovels to get the last of the grain. It was a very socialistic union. Everybody got paid exactly the same. 4 gangs of 20 guys each. Most of them are cops and firemen and prison guards. And if you had to work because you were on duty and your gang was working, you still got paid. I mean, it was that kind of deal. They were paid by the number of bushels they they elevated not by how long it took them. So they were always moving. This to me was sort of a portrait of the whole of a gang. And I took a trip. I actually met the boat in Duluth, Minnesota, because that's where the grain came. So I met the boat there and then sailed across the Great Lakes with it and then came back with it. And actually, most people don't know this, but George Steinbrenner, who used to own the Yankees, he got his money from his father's money on shipping on the Great Lakes. And that company still owns these boats and still pays these guys. But one of my professors, did a lot of work with oral history. So I decided to get a master's degree. If I'm going to do this work, might as well get it and formalize it. So one was Mike Frisch, and the other one was Bruce Jackson, who was an English professor, but did a lot of documentary work and did books and photographs in prison systems in Louisiana, recorded prison songs, did movies. I took that project instead of expanded it. Where does this come from? So one of my students' cousin had a wheat farm in Kansas, and so a couple summers I stayed on the wheat farm and then photographed that process of the farmer and the field and the small elevator and the people that worked in the elevators. The guy on the right was the guy I stayed with, and you can't cut wheat until it dries. So typically in the morning they'd all get together and have breakfast and talk about the weather. And just went around and photographed, and then said, well, where does this, it's coming to Buffalo, but not in 1959, the U.S. and Canadian government expanded the St. Lawrence Seaway, and all of a sudden, ocean-going ships could bypass Buffalo, coming up into the Great Lakes and leaving. So the only grain coming to Buffalo was being used there. And so now a lot of it was going down the Mississippi to New Orleans. So I went down, did the whole thing with the barge on the Mississippi, going down to New Orleans. And in this, as I was doing this more and more, I learned, by looking at Minor White's work and reading it, is that, the idea that a photograph shouldn't just be of what it is, but what it also can be. And so, in this case, this is grain being put into the hold of a boat, and to me it looked like a quarter note rather than grain. And so I started seeing differently during this project. I also started seeing differently. We'd go out and take trips out in the Southwest, and you'd be driving for 50 miles, and I started looking in the rearview mirror and started thinking about it as a frame to make photographs. And so I started saying to myself, maybe I should get a panorama camera and make photographs like that, especially because in this project, people were seeing my photographs, but they didn't get a sense of the scale of what they were doing it in. So I hadn't envisioned my first exhibit having these big prints of things like this grain elevator in Salina, Kansas, or this is an image taken from the boat leaving Duluth Harbor on Lake Superior, or this is the boat I stayed up in here, but this is the Steinbrenner boat that in Buffalo, docked and being unloaded. I worked, like I said, 16 years on this. The work is now, there's a 12-print portfolio of this work that the George Eastman House purchased. And so it was kind of, for me, I remember being in school and reading sort of the history of photography by the then director of the George Eastman House and never having any idea that my work would ever be in there. And so when that happened, it was, to me, like climbing Mount Everest. And the work is scheduled to be shown in the Birchfield Penny Art Center in Buffalo, and I'm working on this as a book. This lesson of don't be afraid of change. Ansel Adams predicted this whole thing with electronic imaging, right? And that if he was alive, he would be, he'd be having the electronic zone system book. I told you in 1984 we started using digital in ophthalmology. I was like the guy that was against it. I'd be at the meeting saying, wait a minute, resolution isn't the same as film. I always looked at what I did in ophthalmic photography with sort of like the mother and father question. Would I do it on my mother and father? Or would I do it on myself? And so if the resolution wasn't good enough on digital, why would I switch from film, right? And yeah, it was faster and it was easier because a lot of stuff we did in ophthalmology had to be processed right away, and then the laser treatment had to be given that day. And it obviously made it easier doing it on digital. But I was like the anti-digital guy and made fun of, which is ironic because then having this foot in fine art In the commercial side, I started seeing, one of my former students told me about these camera backs that were being made with a full frame 35 millimeter sensor on them by Philips, right? They were 6 megapixels and they were being sold. And so I put together a business plan because I thought, I mean, here we're using 35 millimeter cameras on retinal cameras. Why can't I just take this and put it on there? And so there was one of the Imaging USA meetings was in Atlanta, and I put a business plan together and went to all the different companies. And one company, Megavision, understood what I was talking about. The other companies wanted to sell me boxes, but I needed somebody who was going to partner with me. This is 1999. This is before USB. This is before all the things we have now. And I needed somebody that could take a 6 megapixel image, capture it, and display it on a monitor in less than a second, as fast as you can shoot, right? So Ken Boyston, president of Megavision, says, listen, I'll send some stuff out. I had a fundus camera in our garage, and in one day we put this together and made it work on a fundus camera, and partnered and started doing and my thought was, well, maybe we can get as good as film. Thing is, we got better than film. I mean, we were able to see in an eye with fluorescein the smallest capillaries in the fovea, in the center, in the macula, in the center of vision, right? And so that was, to me, amazing. And found somebody to partner with to start a company that already had a medical device company and created the system. And at that time, there's probably only about 5% of the people in ophthalmology were using digital. And so, we had one camera back that was color, one monochrome, or we can do color and monochrome on a camera back. And we put together some beta sites or beta software, because we had capture software, but we didn't have the whole thing figured out yet. And so we advertised that we were going to sell 12 alpha sites if they would work with us to help develop this. And we had 50 people sign up. The problem with that was that the CEO of the company said, well, if 50 people are ready to buy this, why do we need to develop software? And I was like, we're going to be a software company until we're no longer a company. We have to develop software. So we had this disagreement, and he says, okay, fine, leave. And he did. He fired me. And so my wife and I were down in Florida for one of her meetings, and I was coming to, I came home at night, and my lawyer had put together a thing about me leaving the company. And I got up on that Tuesday morning, and I turned on the TV, and I watched that. And all of a sudden, this not having a job, losing this stock options, losing the money, all this stuff didn't seem as important anymore as what was happening. So a couple of weeks later, I did put the announcement out, and another company got in touch with me, took the technology over there, and we pretty much took over not just the country but the world in terms of selling this. It was a tipping point for digital imaging of the retina, and we put together not just the capture stations, but the image management systems, the integration with electronic medical records, the taking in of all the information from the other imaging modalities in ophthalmology to be able to look at that in one place, which back then nobody was doing. So at the same time, I also started some other projects, personal projects. This is a project that I saw this, and I made this photograph, and we had moved back to Atlanta, and I was just amazed at how the Old South was being just torn up in Atlanta. Anything's 20 years old, they tear it down. And so I started photographing. This was something that was entitled the Mall of Georgia, the MAUL of Georgia, because they were just building a mall of Georgia. But I mean, that's what it felt like to me, that everything was just being torn up. And so I started that project. I also, if you saw that chimney in the other photograph, I did a lot of driving, and I started noticing these chimneys. And I'd photograph them for a couple of years. And people had asked me why they were still there, and I'd have no idea, but I said I'd find out. And one day there was a sort of antebellum home with 40 acres for sale in Middle Georgia, and we called about it and finally got a hold of the guy, and he said that the woman had taken it off the market and was trying to sort of talk me out of wanting to buy something there because of where it was. And I said, oh, yeah, I know where it is. And he's like, well, how do you know? I said, well, old Highway 16 goes through there, and it's a long story, but, there's these old chimneys along there, and I've been photographing them from the last couple of years. He goes, oh, he says, you mean Sherman Sentinels? And then it dawned on me that all these chimneys I was photographing were in and around Atlanta, from Atlanta to Savannah. And actually, I'd also explained it because sometimes I found them in South Carolina or North Carolina. And so there was this whole thing. Now, all the chimneys that were there weren't from the Civil War, but there's this sort of now collective memory when an old place is either torn down or burns down, they leave up these chimneys. So that was interesting. I did a project on family-owned tobacco farms in Kentucky. Stayed, again, with a family. Here's some photos of guys waiting for their check after they auctioned off their tobacco. But like anything, there's no guarantee that just because you've made good photos before that you're going to do it again. And I mean, for me, I continue to work on projects. One of them is a project actually sort of between here and in Atlanta, the northernmost, where they still grow cotton, and so has a family-owned cotton gin. So we've been photographing that for the last couple of years. Jim here in the audience and I were one of 12 people that were put on Adobe's Biomedical Imaging Advisory Group when they came out with Photoshop CS3 Extended, which had medical, scientific, and technical imaging tools in it. So we worked on that together, and you had places like this where you can measure things and do things on an image that you couldn't do before. I took that and actually created an organization called the Digital Imaging Institute for Science and Medicine. This is at a time when there were, many people knew nothing about digital imaging, especially doctors and researchers. So we did that, and came out with our own electronic journal that we sent out, and actually then started doing both one-day Photoshop courses around the country, and then also photography workshops for physicians. This one was for ophthalmologists, where we'd bring in ophthalmologists, sort of teach during the day ophthalmic imaging and things like Photoshop and Lightroom, but get up in the morning early and photograph into the afternoon, and then at night sit around in rooms like this and work on images. Also learned that, as Henry Cartier-Bresson said, your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. So the more I photographed, I felt the more I was able to make better photographs, or at least have a higher percentage of images that I at least considered to be somewhat good. And I thought of it was like, we go through school and we do a lot of this stuff, but the reality is it's just a ticket into the game. I mean, then now that you're in the game, you got to do something with it while you're there. Or I also thought of it, if you remember the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, where in ice skating they'd have the compulsories. You had to do this complicated, course that you had to go through before you could compete, right? And I think that's a lot of what we do, or a lot, at least what I did in my life, was doing the compulsories and getting sort of good, so that I could actually start thinking about making images without thinking about how I made them. That it just became part of what I did. I had always wanted to combine my documentary with ophthalmology, and I don't know how many years it's been now, but I got my first chance to do a mission with Orbis, which is the Flying Eye Hospital. It's a plane that has an operating room in it, exam room, teaching center. And they fly around the world with volunteer physicians doing skill transfer. And so I went with them not only to teach other people how to do ophthalmic photography, but I mean, they also partner with the local hospital. So things are going on everywhere in terms of teaching, but I also wanted to photograph. And the first mission I went to was to Nigeria, which was just before all those girls got kidnapped, and so we had armed guards with us everywhere. We couldn't go anywhere in the not even out of our hotel, but it was still able to photograph. But working in hospitals that were it's 110 degrees in the hospital. There's no windows, no glass on the windows. The washing up for surgery was a 55-gallon drum there, and so. But going through and documenting and working with, I've done 4 of these missions to different parts of the world, and to me, it's I want to try and do something with this to get people aware that there's so many simple things that can be given to people around the world that save their lives. I mean, you have a young girl who is in school and her grandmother can't see because she has cataracts, and so she gets pulled out of school to take care of her grandmother. That stops her life, really. And a simple operation can get her grandmother seen, and she could go back in school again. But I mean, they're literally making glasses with pliers, and so you see, you just get this diverse back and forth of what you do and what we do here and what happens around the world. I've worked as a consultant for a number of companies. This is something that I invented. We talked about using iPhones, right? Well, this is an iPhone imaging system to go on one of those slit lamps. Steve Jobs spent billions of dollars building an iPhone that's a camera and a computer. So instead of having some camera hooked up to a computer over here, why not use that and the imaging system? And so it does, and it sends images in a HIPAA-compliant way to EMR right then and there. And I mean, I think this is the way we're going in ophthalmology. More and more, you're going to have imaging that's going to be done of everybody rather than just when it's just something that's wrong. Worked on a handheld retinal camera. This was a ophthalmologist from Emory, but it works in Kilimanjaro, and she discovered cerebral malaria. So these kids get this, and they're in a coma, but nobody knows why they're in a coma. And the only way you can diagnose it is by looking at their retina, but nobody in Africa, or almost nobody in Africa, knows how to use an indirect ophthalmoscope to look at the retina. So this is a way of coming up with a simpler way to look at their retina, document it, send an image, and then have somebody then say yes, and then start treating them rather than just letting them die. One of the projects just got done with about a year and a half ago was, and I think this is the future in ophthalmology, is worked on a project where we were able to photograph and predict Alzheimer's 10 to 15 years before the typical PET scan and cerebral fluid scan is done as a gold standard. So I mean, the theory was if these beta amyloid plaques were collecting in the brain, and the eye's part of the brain, so researchers at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles did this research on mice and rats and found that, you can see the beta amyloid in the retina. And so we then just expanded it and came up with a way to image it. And now this is a scanning laser rather than a typical imaging system that we were using as a regular fundus camera. Now we're able to do this, and it's now in going on clinical trials worldwide. And there's actually in Edinburgh and London, there are part of the trial. 10 years ago, my wife and I did a trip to Scotland. I know we have somebody here from Scotland, and I think somebody from Wales also. And we did this trip, and at the end of the trip, we decided we were going to go to the Isle of Skye. We knew nothing about Scotland or Isle of Skye, and we did, and we stayed up here at the north end. And on the way up there, we passed by this house for sale along the ocean. And my wife, who was in the back of the room here, decided that was our house. And we had never wanted to have a second home, let alone someplace else. Anyway, long story is that we were fortunate in 2013 to be able to buy this house. And so now we spend time over between the United States and Scotland. I mean, this is an image I made the first time I was there. And this is on the Inner Hebrides Islands, the light and the clouds. I remember waking up the first morning and photographing and saying, if I could be here my life and be able to photograph, I'd be in heaven because of the scenery and that. So here's actually our house right over there. And this is the Kerrang, if anybody's ever been or to Scotland but it's changing temperature, changing clouds, changing light. And it taught me, this is life lesson number 18, it took me 2 years of us being there 3 to 4 times a year, 5 weeks at a time, before I really felt comfortable photographing there. It's a big, expansive island, 50 by 30 miles. There's no straight roads anywhere. Many of the roads are single track roads. They wind back on one another, and just being able to get a feel for the light in the island and photography. But it taught me, again, that whole thing about looking and seeing and slowing down. This just happens. This actually is on the set of islands just beyond us on Lewis and Harris, where these standing stones are older than Stonehenge, except you can actually walk among these, and there's like hardly anybody ever there. And so we take trips out there to photograph. But this is stuff around our house on Skye, and it's just always incredible. I mean, we go there, we live, no internet, no phone, no TV, and when the light changes and you decide to photograph, you can get out and photograph. I started doing workshops there, and so now once a year, I do a small workshop of about 5 or 6 people. We have a 250-year-old 3-story stone lodge that we use that's right on the ocean. Our neighbor grew up there. Her parents, she's in her 70s, but her parents used to own it, and so that's where we work the workshop at. But it's something that's just, to me, very peaceful and enjoyable. Number 19. There's only 20, so we're almost done. Don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a long time making it. I mean, I think that, I had to learn that with my photography too, that just because I went and did all this stuff or went here didn't mean that any of the images were good. Just because I got up, on Skye, this time of the year, right, it's summer. I mean, literally, it's like being in Iceland, because we're only 600 miles south of Iceland. I mean, it never gets dark. So, you're getting up at 2:30 in the morning to go and photograph when the sun comes up. And so just because you do that and you climb up a couple hours up a mountain doesn't mean you got good images. Now, I don't know if the person is here from Wales, but from being from Glasgow, you know this. So you know St. Kilda? So St. Kilda is the furthest island or group of islands west of the UK, and it's the last group of islands before you get to North America. And these islands have been inhabited for the last 4,500 years, and you can have Vikings and Picts and you name it have been there. And in 1930, I think it was, the people that lived there, the numbers had started dwindling. They couldn't feed themselves, and they asked to be evacuated by the government. And so this island it's all stone, and you can go there for like a day or part of a day and walk around and photograph. But a friend of mine arranged a photography workshop where we were actually able to stay there for 5 days, which was an incredible experience. It was like a 4.5, 5-hour boat ride from the Isle of Skye straight west to get to this island. But you see all this that have been, these are corrals. Actually, everybody thought they were corrals, but they were put together to keep the sheep out so they can actually grow something without it being eaten, right? And there are these things called cleats. There are like 1,900 of these on the island, and they're actually there that's where they would store all their food. They would kill fish. They would kill birds during the summer, and then they would salt the meat and have it there to eat during the winter, and they would put them in here. This is actually the cemetery. I mean, there's no wood to bury anybody. They would keep on burying people, and then they'd have to keep on raising the wall as more and more people died, and it got deeper and deeper. This is just an image from along the shore. It was an incredible experience. I also, based out of that work I did in Buffalo, about 6 years ago, I started workshops. A friend of mine owns 6 acres of these abandoned grain elevators, and so I've contracted with him, and I do a workshop, 2.5-day workshop. Actually, we just got done doing it a couple weeks ago, where people get, there's over 1 million square feet of space, and if you love abandoned industrial space, this is like, most people have to break in someplace. So I've been doing these workshops, and I do them because for me, it's a way of that whole history I learned about Buffalo and bringing people there to share it. People come from all over the world to go to these workshops, and also bring people to Buffalo to actually get to learn Buffalo and know about it as a town. And while I do some color there, again, most of my work is still done in black and white. When I'm at Silo City. Finally, I've determined, I don't know how many people know the story of Vivian Maier. Okay, well, those of you who don't, Vivian Maier was a nanny all her life, and mostly in Chicago. And after, and she always had a camera. She was always photographing. No one ever saw her photographs. And after she died, I mean, she got to the point where two of the boys she helped raise, actually, from a wealthier family, put her up and put her in her apartment. And when she finally died, they said, well, what are you going to do with all this stuff? And there was no relative, and so they auctioned it off. And a guy in Chicago bought like 100,000 negatives of hers, and there was probably another guy bought 20 or 25,000 negatives, and he started looking at them. He was doing a book on Chicago, and he started looking at these images and scanning them and putting them on Flickr and getting feedback, and these things were just fantastic. And she's like, if you haven't, look her up. She's the best photographer you've never seen. There's actually a movie called Finding Vivian Maier, but my resolve from that movie and seeing her work was I didn't want to be the next Vivian Maier. And I think for me, I've got all this work that I've done that I haven't archived and collected. I don't even know half of the stuff that I have. And so my goal now is to do that. So I got this little thing called a film toaster. So now a lot of what people are doing is digitally, instead of scanning their negatives, digitizing them with a DSLR. And for me, I'm not looking, when I print something for a show, I have a drum scan done, but this is going to be, for me, a way to do this quickly and get my archive together. So the last life lesson was taught to me by our grandson. I'd come back from that first trip in Nigeria, and I was talking to my son in Milwaukee, and he says, "Do you want to talk to Frank?" And so we're talking, and I'm asking him the typical grandfather stuff, and how is he doing in school, blah blah blah. And I go, "So what do you want?" He's 8 years old. "What do you want to be when you get older?" He's like, "I want to be like Daddy." Our son does a high-end auto body, and he says, "Papa Mark," he says, "what do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm a photographer." He says, "Well, what do photographers do?" And I said, "Well, photographers make photographs." I said, "I told you I just got back from Africa. I was making photographs. I see you and your mom and dad and sister. I photograph you. So photographers, take pictures." And he's like, oh. And he goes, "Well, then I guess everyone's a photographer." And I think that's where we sort of come now, Of course, everyone's a photographer until you put it on manual. But, I think that's, a lot of what we're talking about now. Again, it doesn't make any difference to me what kind of camera I have. I can make a photograph. But I think in many ways we've seen over our career how quality photography has been diminished. I've got a website like everybody does, markmaio.com. I'm represented by Lumiere Gallery in Atlanta, where I sell my work through. I've got a blog that I write, and I continue to stay connected and continue doing photography. People have asked about retiring, and I'll retire. I saw the title of a book once, and it's sort of like what I think about. The title of the book was "I'll Sleep When I Die." And I think, I'll stop photographing when I physically, mentally can't anymore, because I'll continue doing this until that happens. So thanks for your time. And if you have any questions or